screams in the night. Indian legends. Miles of footprints. Sightings. What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Join us for eyewitness accounts, questions and answers, Bigfoot encounters of the past, and ongoing encounters in the present. Your host, two-time witness, field researcher for 43 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. We have a special treat today. We have our good friend John, who is a forensic anthropologist. Of course, Brian and Tom. Fellas, how are you doing today?
Good.
Yeah, very good.
Well, Brian and Tom, I'm going to let you go ahead and jump right in. And if you need my help, you know where I'm at.
Okay. Brian, I'll start off if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. John, I got a quick question. Well, I don't know if it's quick enough, but how, we talk about a lot why bones are not, the remains of Bigfoot are not found. And I'm just wondering, how quickly do bones decompose in a typical forested environment? I've seen some documentaries where it looks like they could decompose like a deer in as little as 7 days. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, so decomposition is going to be a number of different things. There's going to be mechanical breakdown, which is basically scavengers and organisms living off of the remains. We're basically recycling the remains back into the biosphere through eating it and so on. Decomposition, as we traditionally considered it, would be more just the kind of chemical breakdown of mineralization, of acidic activity on, eroding the bones and so on, the remains. So it really depends on a lot of factors. Now, forest soil is usually pretty acidic. You have the breakdown of the leaf litter, things like that, creating a very kind of acidic soil, which can break down bones pretty quickly. If you're talking about 7 days, though, that's not necessarily decomposition. That's predation, right? That's things from very small rodents to larger scavengers pulling pieces away and dispersing them. So the key is, will you find a mass of bones, a body, an articulated or a closely articulated body? Is that likely compared to just finding, individual bones scattered here and there? I've worked homicide cases where, one comes to mind where you had body dumped over down a slope, over a fence down a slope near a road, and within just a few years, arms, legs, torso, skull were in completely different places, tens if not hundreds of yards away from each other, and that was basically only because of scavenging activity. So the point is, if you find one bone or a part of a bone, a knot-on bone or something, or if a person sees that, are they even going to recognize it as, for what it is? Are they going to recognize that it's human or human-like or whatever kind of animal it is? So there's a lot that goes into it. 7 days, I would say, is very ambitious for anything truly decomposing. That really doesn't work. But as far as being scavenged and scattered, absolutely 7 days will do that. I worked another homicide case where a 12-year-old boy was killed and then buried up in the sea. Not even buried. Well, he was kind of buried, shallow buried up in the Sierras, and within just a few days, the bears had completely scattered. We didn't even find a lot of what we were expecting to find. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's
no,
a lot of
yeah, and you're correct. In this documentary that I saw, they did stop motion photography, and there was bugs, all sorts of little animals, and I think even porcupines and stuff nibbling away. But I was surprised that it wasn't just the soil, or like you said, the acid in the soil. It was just the flies and the maggots and everything else decomposing this thing. It was a deer skeleton, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen remains that have been on the surface. I mean, many cases of remains that were on the surface 10, 20, 30 years, not necessarily in forested environments, but not in desert either, that were in pretty darn good shape, by the time I got to them. So it's really, I'm really skeptical of just the notion that they could just disappear within a few days, weeks, or months.
Okay, interesting.
John, on that note, do you think that animals out there in general, I'm not talking just about Bigfoot, but animals in general, one of the reasons why we don't find a lot of bones from them, I mean, if you talk to hunters, they don't really come across tons and tons of animal carcasses and bones, for that matter. But do you think that might be because these creatures, or animals in general, they don't like to be die out in where everybody can see them? There's been talk that a lot of animals, they'll go to a hidden place to die, and I'm just wondering if you think that's true. That's one of the reasons why we don't come across a lot of bones from animals.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably, there's a lot to that. I mean, pretty much every kind of animal, mammals in particular, but every kind of animal has their own version of shelter, whatever that may be, whether it's a hole in the ground or a cave, or, a hole in a rock or up in a tree or whatever. And so if you think about it, if you've been predated on, if you've been, hunted and killed, if you've become something's prey, well, then when you are killed, you're going to be consumed. You're going to be scavenged. You're going to be kind of spread to the four winds, so to speak. If you're dying of other causes, of disease, of injury, or whatever, if you think about it, any animal with a relatively big brain and the ability to feel, which is basically all mammals, are going to seek some sort of shelter, because being sick means being vulnerable to predation, being uncomfortable, being in pain. And so when humans too, when we're in those conditions, we tend to seek shelter and comfort and enclosure. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty logical assumption.
Mm-hmm. Hey, John, I wanted to also ask about with bones and DNA, and this is just kind of a question about science in general. What is the difference between mitochondrial DNA and other DNA? Because I know that mitochondrial, it lives outside the nucleus, and I'm just curious as to what the difference is between the DNA that you found and what they call mitochondrial DNA.
So mitochondrial DNA are the DNA that make up the mitochondria in the cell, which is basically the powerhouse of the cell. It's the energy factory of the cell, and in outside of the nucleus of the cell is the cytoplasm, and so there'll be dozens and dozens and dozens of mitochondria in the cytoplasm. And I'm trying to remember, I think the mitochondria is made up of something like 40 different genes, something like that. So relatively speaking, it's very, very short. It's also inherited maternally. So, for example, my mitochondrial DNA is identical to my mother's, and so on. So that's what we call it, mitochondrial Eve. For example, you could trace somebody's lineage back through the female line based on their mitochondrial DNA. So the problem is, because it's inherited that way, it is much less variable than nuclear DNA. With nuclear DNA is the genetic fingerprint that makes a person, completely unique as an individual. Mitochondrial DNA, I could share mitochondrial DNA with my siblings, for example. So it's much less of a hit as far as a positive identification on things. But because it's so numerous in the cell, it's more easily recovered and dealt with, And the other thing too is mitochondrial DNA, because it is inherited the way that it is, there's a kind of a estimation of, okay, how long does it take for mutations to arise in the mitochondrial DNA? So for example, if the mitochondrial DNA is so different from the original human ancestors, modern human ancestors, to now, can we estimate how long, based on mutation rate, how many years has gone by? The problem with that, and I've always had a little bit of a problem with that, because mutation by definition is random, so you really can't clock it. But some people try to do what's called the mitochondrial clock. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of just a basic overview of mitochondrial DNA.
Yeah, no, it does. It does.
That's a good question, Brian. And I'm going to just kind of follow up a little bit on that. So it sounds like it's actually the nuclear DNA that determines things like, hair color, eye color, that sort of thing.
Oh yeah. The mitochondria is only, it doesn't determine any traits. It just helps to create energy for the cell, for cellular, productivity.
Okay, interesting. And I'm just going to shift gears a little bit here, but if somebody was, let's say, for example, somebody's out in the forest or somewhere in, on some public lands or whatever, is there a special protocol that needs to be observed if they discover some, say, for example, Native American artifacts, like maybe a burial ground or even, stone tools and or some sort of a habitat, ancient habitat? Is there a protocol that needs to be followed?
Yeah, there is. There's federal and state laws. So in California, for example, where I did most of my forensic work, we had CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, which includes cultural remains, things like that. And I'll explain that a little bit here in a second. But even more broad than that is the NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a federal act, which basically says that if you find Native American remains that you think are Native American, they have to be handled a certain way. So, for example, I had many cases where I was called out because a body was found. It was usually buried. It was buried, and maybe they're digging a utility line or something like that. And so they found remains, and so I would go out there, and the first thing, I'd go through my regular protocol of the questions, and one of them would be, is it human or is it animal? Okay, it's human. Okay, well, if it's human, the next question is it Native American or is it modern? And if it's Native American, my work would immediately cease. I would have to call the Native American Heritage Commission, and they would send out their archaeologist, who I worked with all the time. They would send him out, and the scene would now, it's no longer a forensic scene, it's a Native American scene, and they would take it from there. And what they would do is, depending on the nature of the situation, they would either leave the remains there if they could, or they would remove them and take them to a Native American, place of burial. There was a number of those kind of throughout Northern California, of different grave areas that the Native American groups would utilize. But if you could, like, for example, if you're building a road, if it's unreasonable to do an entire archaeological excavation on the road, if you're going to stop some major work, then the question is, okay, do we just leave it, or do we take it out, or what do we do? If it's something where you can divert the construction to a different direction or a different kind of thing or something, then that might be acceptable too. But the answer to your question is, there's absolutely a protocol, and you have to be very careful about those things, because if it's native, I don't know if you guys have heard of Kennewick Man, which was up in Washington. That was a whole NAGPRA thing where the question was, is it native or is it not native? And the scientists who discovered it and wanted to study it were arguing that it's not native. Of course, it was like 10,000 years old or something. But the native groups are saying, well, wait a minute, if it's that old, then it must be native. Therefore, you have no jurisdiction over it. You can't do anything with it. We have to rebury it. So, there's very, very strict rules about that.
Yeah, it was a controversy. So hypothetically, and I realize this is purely hypothetical question, if somebody was to run across the remains, either skeletal remains or maybe even a body of a Bigfoot, maybe on a shore, somewhere on a shore of a lake or out in the woods or wherever, is there, and what sort of a process or protocol should be followed?
Well, that's a great question. Because you have to have a whole host of things have to kind of line up a certain way for any meaningful assessment to be done of the remains. And I think Will and I have talked about this a bit. I mean, so for example, let's just kind of do a thought experiment here. Let's say that a bone was found, which is more likely than a set of bones, right? We've covered that at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So let's say a bone is found. So the first thing that has to happen is somebody has to say, hey, that's a bone in the middle of the forest or whatever, and it doesn't look like it's animal, right? And so the next question is going to be, okay, well, if it's not animal, is it human? And if it's human, is it native or is it modern? Well, it's going to be hard to even get to that point because most people are going to look at a bone in the forest and say, yeah, it's just a bone of an animal, unless they really understand anatomy. The other thing, too, is if you're talking about a bipedal primate, a hominid or hominin, as they call them now, in other words, if you're talking about a Bigfoot, the question, you would have to have somebody to say, yes, that looks human, because it would certainly look human. An upright, bipedal hominin, Bigfoot, the skeleton is gonna look human, very human. So someone has to say, that looks human, but it's not quite human. In fact, I think it needs to be studied. And to me, even though it would be, the bones would probably be much bigger, of course, to me, I just think there's probably a lot of repatriated, I mean, if Bigfoot is out there, right, there's probably a number of repatriated Native American bones that are neither native or human, because, if you find a femur, a humerus, a tibia, fibula, whatever, a long bone or shorter bones, irregular bones from a Sasquatch, it's going to look human, and if it's out there for a while, it's going to look like it might be native. I just think most of them are probably, the other thing too is we probably have these kinds of bones sitting in coroners, freezers, throughout the country with not knowing who they are and what pieces of, what individuals they came from. So, I mean, I did forensics for 4 counties in Southern California and 2 counties in Northern California. And our freezers were full of partial remains that we just did not know who the people were. And I can imagine to the untrained eye, humerus from a Bigfoot can look like look like a big guy. So I don't know if that answers, but the protocol.
Well, it does, but it's interesting.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, that's the question I always ask myself. I mean, we have to recognize that the reality is, if something is found out there, people say nothing's ever been found. And my contention is, I'm sure tons of stuff's been found. The question is, has it been recognized for what it is? The other thing, too, is think about DNA. And I'm sorry to wax on, but think about DNA for a second. How many times do you think something has been found, and so, hey, that might be Bigfoot, and so we send it to a lab, it gets sent to a lab, and people test it, and what they're hoping for is unidentified primate. But the lab is going to look at it, and they're going to say, wow, look how close that is to human. It must be a contaminated sample. It was contaminated by the people who were handling it, people who collected it, the DNA process, and they're going to say, oh, nope, contaminated. Well, guess what? We are probably looking at something that genetically is very close to human. So you're never even going to get to the point where you say, yes, it's close to human, but it's not human. What you're going to get is there's so much human in it that it must be contaminated.
That is very fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So John, that's a great point. And on that note, kind of a follow-up question, because that was a great question by Tom, but it's kind of a follow-up question. When something goes into the DNA computer database, how quickly does that disappear? I mean, do they keep records of these things? So in other words, if somebody finds DNA, 2 years from now, and they can maybe compare it to something else that was out there, would they be able to identify this is the same source, the same creature, or does that information just disappear from the database?
Well, it depends on who's doing the protocol. If it's not a forensic lab situation, then I don't think it's going to sit in a database waiting for a match, right? So it's not like a CODIS database where you have an unidentified, body, and you put the DNA in the database, hoping that one day some relative or some evidence is going to be compared to it. But if you're talking about just, hey, found something out in the woods, take it to a biology lab, see what it is. They'll come back, they'll run it through the system and see whether it aligns up with genotypically, put it in GenBank or whatever. They're not gonna keep it in there waiting for a match. They're just gonna be comparing it against their existing database.
So the signatures, the DNA signatures, I'm just using a lay term because I don't know exactly what you'd call them, but they get stored in I understand there's like a GenBank, the Human Genome Project.
Yeah, GenBank and the Human Genome Project are different. GenBank is basically the genotypes, in other words, the DNA profiles of different living organisms, put into a bank for comparison, right? So if you find something, you can tell it's a dog, it's horse, it's whatever. And then the Human Genome Project is mapping genetic variability throughout the geographic, world.
Okay. Now, is there, I think I've heard there's the equivalent of the GenBank, which is called the ZooBank, which is for identifying animals, right?
Well, yeah. So I believe what that is if you're if you're a zoo, you want to be very, very careful about your breeding populations. You don't want inbreeding and so forth. So you're going to make sure you're going to do very careful genetic studies to make sure that if you're mating, for example, two cheetahs, that you're not mating the same cheetahs, and that you don't want to mix up the same genes into the offspring. You need genetic variation in order for the species to be healthy. So those databases are kept in particular when zoos do breeding programs like Cincinnati Zoo and the London Zoo or whatever. They want to breed each other's animals. They got to make sure that they have good genetic variation. So I think that's what that's about.
Okay, and I think they have to be extra careful when it comes to cheetahs because cheetahs are, yeah. But I wonder if the ZooBank could possibly be used for not just to make sure that we keep the families separate, but also to identify. I wonder if they could take maybe a core sample or something from a bone and say, oh, okay, well, that was a chimpanzee, or is that a possibility? Or
well, yeah, but you have yeah, I mean, the ZooBank would be able to say if it's a chimpanzee. The ZooBank would be able to say it's a chimpanzee that's sitting in the Leipzig Zoo named Bonzo. That's what the ZooBank would be able to do. GenBank is where you would say, oh, okay, this is Pan troglodyte, this is a chimpanzee, or this is Ursus americanus, it's a black bear, or whatever, right? So that is the species level. The ZooBanks are individual levels because they want to make sure that the individuals who are mating, are not too closely related.
Okay, gotcha. Interesting. Okay.
To kind of switch gears a little bit, this is sort of an ethical question, but I guess this is for John and Tom, and also Will if he wants to weigh in too on this. Talking about DNA, we've gotten a lot of reports of the different types, and some of the types people report seeing almost like a human face in their encounter. And it kind of begs the question that if somebody were to just go out there and shoot one of these things, could that be considered like a homicide because these things are so closely related to DNA, or would it just be considered a wild animal? I mean, I don't think that this would ever come up in a legal case necessarily, but it does beg the question that ethically, should somebody go out there and shoot these things if they're unarmed and they're not attacking them? I mean, would that almost be comparable to, killing a human being?
Well, I mean, just give my answer. I mean, it's hard to know, but you never know what will happen. I mean, there have been factions probably 10, 15 years ago there were groups that were seeking for chimpanzees, Pan troglodyte and Pan paniscus, to be given human rights, because once it was discovered that their DNA was 98.5% like ours, that they took it to the extreme and said, well, they're just like us, we should give them human rights, take them out of the zoos, that kind of thing. So that's a very extremist standpoint, but the fact that it can happen suggests that, if I would imagine if someone shoots one, it'd be controversial on a lot of levels, but the proximity to humans, I think, would make it a very inflammatory case, although who knows.
Hey, fellas.
Yeah.
And John, I'm sure you'll agree with us. There's probably enough morphological differences to classify this as a separate species, non-human. My voice is still kind of messed up, guys. So if it's classified, as a hominid but not human, there wouldn't be any laws governing that. So I personally don't think there'd be any. The first time around, wouldn't be any issues, and then of course there'd be a whole slew of laws put into place afterwards. But that's my take.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I mean, it wouldn't be. Yeah, literally on the books, you wouldn't have done anything, as far as homicide goes. But like I say, it would spur all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
I have a couple of interesting questions. And this is, again, we're getting a little bit speculative, but the heels, the width of the footprints for Bigfoot are considerably wider, the ratio, the proportion, than humans. Can you speculate the reason why? Would that be maybe to support the additional weight, the bone mass, or the muscle mass and all that? Or looking for a comment, any comment you might have on that.
It could be a number of things. It could have to do with terrain, right, and the type of terrain that the organism is adapted to. It could do with the hip flexors, the muscles that abduct and adduct the legs. How do they go in? How far in do they go in a straight line at the center line of the body, versus are they more lateral? In one case you would need a wider splay than another case. It could be a lot of those things, combination of environment and how the muscles are put together.
Yeah, and I realize it's a question that's purely in the realm of speculation at this point.
Well, a lot of science is speculation, right? We speculate on why things have Neanderthals. Why do Neanderthals have a big brow ridge and a big, what we call an occipital bun on the back of the head? The speculation is that their heads are so big and heavy that when they run, their face would bob up and down and they wouldn't be able to see where they were going, and so they knew this big counterweight on the back of the head. Total speculation. We'll never know for sure, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah, well, and speaking of that, is intelligence proportional to cranial size? In other words, if the bigger the brain, the smarter the creature. Is there a correlation between that?
Not if we're talking about absolute size. If we're talking about the bigger the brain, as in the different parts of the brain, like the frontal lobe and so on. I mean, one of the reasons we have the forehead, as humans evolved, our forehead became more vertical and taller and so on, is because of that frontal lobe and neocortex, to grow the head. So if you're saying a brain is bigger because it has more parts, like Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which deal with speech and so on, then yeah, that means bigger. But if you're just talking about absolute, cubic centimeters, then not necessarily. I mean, Neanderthals had very big brains. They weren't big vertically. They were big. They bulged at the sides. We don't know if they had speech because there's really no evidence of Broca and Wernicke's areas. But they did have very big cranial capacity, I think like 1530 or something like that, cranial capacity, maybe 1600 cubic centimeters. So very big brains, but we know their behavior compared to modern humans was not nearly as complex.
Well, that's exactly kind of where I was going with this question, because we get so many reports from eyewitnesses who see these things, and there's a common comment that they're just flabbergasted at the size of its head. It's immense. And so that's kind of where I was going with this. I just wonder, my gosh, if this thing's got such a big head, a big brain, are they as smart as us? How smart are these things? So again, it's the realm of speculation.
Well, I doubt with the size of the brain, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, but with the size of the brain, I doubt they're complete imbeciles. I mean, even Neanderthals were very, 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 very smart. They just weren't their behavior wasn't quite as complex as modern humans. And when you look at the two skulls, Neanderthals long, low, bulging at the sides. Modern humans more vertical, more narrow, more brain going upward. So yeah, I don't mean to say that they'd be dumb brutes, but just not quite as complex as moderns, perhaps.
John, actually, I have a good follow-up question to that. And this is not just talking about Bigfoot, but in general, what's the difference between the left side of the brain versus the right side of the brain? And do you see a difference between other primates like chimpanzees and gorillas and humans?
As far as the lateral nature of the brain? I've not read any studies about if there's a corollary in we have a lateral kind of differentiation in our brain.
Yeah, well, I just heard that one side of the brain deals with pictures and images, and then the other side deals with words and print, basically. So I was just curious if you had read anything about that, or and what the difference might be between other apes and humans.
Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, so there is a difference on the different sides, right? So I mean, everything from left-handed and right-handed is governed by the side of your brain that you're dominant. There is speech and language centers are on one side, and more emotional processing is kind of on the other side. Facial recognition's on a certain side. So there is different functions. Functionally, the brain is the different size, the different hemispheres do different things. I guess what I was saying is I've not read any studies that look at that in non-human primates, although I would imagine it's the same thing. I would imagine that there's an analogy there. I mean, if we're that closely related, it would be, except that the behavior is so much less complex, there'd be less of those behaviors to differentiate. But I'd be willing to bet that the different hemispheres in non-human primates play just as important role as in us.
Hey, fellas, I just want to back up just a sec. When we get a lot of these reports, witnesses will far too often anthropomorphize a Sasquatch's behavior. In other words, they're placing their own values and ideas, humanistic things on animals. We do it to stuff and other animals all the time. So, so when somebody's talking about it behaved, X, Y, Z, and they're trying to move towards a conclusion about its, cognitive abilities, I think that's more about placing their own human views on it than what the animal's actually doing.
Yeah,
and actually, that's... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry, Tom. No, I was going to say
we're all going at once.
No, that's a great point, Will, because a lot of times we think of these experiences, these encounters that people have, as almost being kind of like planned out. But no, actually, we're catching them at kind of the heat of the moment. I mean, they weren't planning on us to be there or to be looking at them. So a lot of times that we do have kind of spontaneous reactions, but they're also reacting spontaneously because they weren't expecting us to be there. So I think that does make a difference in terms of when we're looking at cognitive abilities and so forth. Sometimes they're just reacting just out of sheer human nature.
Yeah, my kind of jump in there would just be to say that it's absolutely true what Will's saying, right? We tend to boil everything down to human behavior and everything is acting just like us, which is way too simplistic. But I will say, though, that even in the more kind of, other primate, the anthropoids generally, like monkeys and so on, that group of organisms, of animals, is like humans in that they are so keyed socially. They're meant for social groups. They're meant for social bonding. They're meant for dominance and submissiveness. They're meant for cooperation and that kind of thing. So there are really, even though they don't have human behaviors, they do have social behaviors that resemble our behaviors. And so we would never say Will's right, we should never say that they behave like us or they're just like us, but we can certainly draw analogies. Like, for example, dominance hierarchies with primates. I've as a forensic scientist, I've worked with law enforcement for decades now, and I see dominance hierarchies in law enforcement agencies just like I see them in troops of gelato monkeys. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's really true.
And with the Sasquatch, that's very much so. It's very pronounced in the behaviors in these groups.
Yeah, it would.
And not just the dominance, but I mean, the whole social structure that we know of so far.
Yeah.
It would have to be.
One thing that I think we all have in common, the Bigfoot, non-human primates, humans, are emotions, right? And we're driven by emotions, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so there's a portion of the brain, and again, speculation here, but it'd be interesting if we ever did get one of these things. I think it's called the amygdala that handles emotions. I'm just wondering if that would be, present in a Bigfoot, and if so, would it play a real dominant role? Because we've heard that these things are extremely temperamental, very, it sounds like they're just in a very emotional animal, as well as, very aware of their surroundings.
Yeah, the amygdala is where you get your fight or flight, right? It's what makes you nervous and on edge and anxious. It's that evolutionary safety mechanism which keeps you on guard. It is that reptile part of the brain, we speak. And so, yes, in primates, I mean, I realize you're not asking a question, but I'll just weigh in. In non-human primates, it's very, just like in humans, but even more so, because they lack the kind of the rational, cognitive, let's think it through thing, right? They lack that. They can be taught that. They can be conditioned to think their way through puzzles, to find food rewards and things like that. But generally speaking, they're very, very emotionally driven. It's that emotional limbic system that is basically, on edge and what's in it for me and how I react in this given situation. So I would imagine that there's somewhere between a chimpanzee and a human should be where a Bigfoot would be is on that scale.
Yeah, that's a great point, John, because we do have a lot of reports of these creatures being really, really violent, but it sometimes makes you wonder, though, are they just out there trying to attack us, or is it something more emotional? For example, a mother protecting her children or just interrupting their hunt. And it seems a lot of times that maybe they're not out there to necessarily kill all human beings, but if you interrupt them or if you are seen as a threat to their children, just like chimpanzees and just like gorillas are, they're going to react to that.
Yeah, I don't see at all that they would be kind of banding together to try to cause our extinction or anything. I think you're exactly right. They're living day to day, the prerogatives day to day, food, shelter, protection, mates, things like that. That's just what they're doing.
Yeah.
One of the questions I had was, then this is one that I had with Will a couple of episodes back, but the opposing thumb. My understanding is with the opposing thumb is not so much a structural ability of the hand, but it's more the brain controlling that function. And how would that play a role in primates and Bigfoot with tool usage and maybe even weapon usage?
Well, I mean, that's a great point. Will knows how strongly I feel about this, but I mean, yeah, I mean, so if you think of it this way, yes, you have to have the mental apparatus to be able to work the thumb, but if you have the thumb, if you have the structure for your opposable thumb, you have the mental apparatus to work it. Those things go hand in hand, and so even the earliest primates, with earliest opposable thumb primates, the early prosimians and early monkeys, were perfectly capable of operating their thumbs. But once you have a fully opposable thumb, and once you're able to, do lots of different things with your hand, carry things, make things, throw things, then the game is on, right? So, I mean, lots of monkeys throw things and make things. I mean, capuchin monkeys in Central America will pound nuts with rocks. I mean, that stuff happens all the time. So and Will knows how I feel about this, but there's no way in my mind that if a Bigfoot's out there, and I'm not skeptical, I'm just saying I've never seen one, so I say if they're out there, there's no way they're not using tools. There's just no way. And it's the same thing I was saying before about the bones. If you saw some sort of manufactured stone tool out there in the middle of nowhere, you would immediately say, everyone would immediately say, oh, look, we found a Native American site, right? We would say, here's some flakes from a Native American point or,
Sure.
Something, right? That's what we would say. And so how many things are sitting in museums that we have said are Native American that may not even be human?
And that's very common.
That is pretty mind-boggling. So these things, Bigfoot, people report that they throw rock sticks, pine cones, and I guess technically that would be considered a form of tool usage. Is that right?
Oh, sure, but they would be way beyond that. They'd be way beyond that. I mean, chimpanzees are making sticks to fish termites out of holes and to get marrow out of bones. I mean, so there's just no way that these things are doing way more than just throwing things. I don't see it. I don't see the possibility, especially living in the environments that we're talking about.
What would what sort of things might be considered as tools that people could, that was just the very thing that I was thinking was, my gosh, we got to be looking for other stuff. If you're looking for evidence of their presence in a certain area.
Well, I mean, basically any material object that they are either that they're using for a purpose or that they're refashioning for a purpose, right? So if they're like reworking any stone into like choppers, like old one style choppers from South Africa 2.5 million years ago, a chopper or a hand axe, or I doubt they would have projectile technology, bows, arrows, long distance spears, atlatls, things like that. But I think that they're probably using the material around them to cut up things, to grind things, to kill things, to process things, for sure. They're probably building, they have to be building shelters of some sort. I mean, so all of those things are tools. So they're probably using wood a lot for, getting marrow out of bones or processing skins or whatever. And of course, you're going to run across that, and then no one's even going to notice that it was a tool.
And fellas, years ago, when I first discovered the tree breaks, actually Bob Titmus and those people discovered that, but they didn't know what it was. In 1991, I found a really pronounced one, and it was something I knew there had to be more out there than simply footprints. So I started thinking about these different things. Then when I found that line of trees, it sort of hit me that there were things that they were doing that we simply don't recognize. We think it's just part of the normal background, and it's stuff that they're doing. So
getting back to the stone tools, I mean, this is fascinating. Do you think they're actually napping rocks, like to make a cutting stone or a cutting edge or something like that?
Well, maybe, but I mean, when you look at human tool technology, it for a couple million years, the main tool was what's called the Oldowan chopper, which is basically, you wouldn't even necessarily recognize it as a tool. It's basically a rock, or round rock that's been knocked about so that it has kind of one cutting edge, one kind of rough cutting edge. And so you have a devil of a time if you had a bunch of rocks. You'd say, okay, which ones have been worked and which ones haven't? They're so close to, it's kind of hard to tell. But as you go on, after a couple million years, you start to have what we call the Acheulean hand axe, which was named after a site in France called Saint-Achille. But it's basically, instead of being worked on one side, it's worked on both sides, and it fits in the hand, and it's got a point and all that kind of stuff. And that lasted for about 1 million years. So stone tool technology has been very, very slow as far as the archaeological record. But when you get to modern humans, and all of a sudden you have core technology, blade technology, you have all kinds of different materials being used. So I'm not sure what to expect, but I would think that you'd probably be stuck somewhere in the Oldowan, in the maybe early Acheulean, but probably Oldowan style tools, where you have rocks with singular sharp edges. But again, that's complete speculation. The only reason I'm saying that is because if you had full-blown Acheulean hand axes, people would be like, oh my gosh, there's like these European and African style tools in the middle of the Pacific Northwest or whatever. I think that would have raised because they're very obviously reworked, Oldowan or not.
Fellas, here's a thought. I was listening to John, and it just kind of struck me. We're always hearing people talk about, quote unquote, tree knocks or noises to that effect. Some of that, I'm pretty sure, is tongue pops. But here's a thought, and let me get your thoughts on this. What if it were them using some form of tool, to manipulate whatever it is they're doing that people are hearing?
Yeah, I think that's very possible.
Yeah, that would be. So it wouldn't necessarily be a form of communication. Maybe they would. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that's any form of communication anyway. I think there are other things going on.
So
it could be removing limbs or something from a tree. I'm sorry, Brian.
Or it could be smashing something into pulp. It could be doing lots of things.
I mean, Will, that was actually my next question. Do you think they're doing it to intimidate people who are in the area, or is it some form of communication between, if they're in the middle of a hunt or something like that?
I don't think that, if those noises are actually going on, I don't think they're directed at people whatsoever. It's whatever activities they're doing amongst themselves.
Yeah, okay. I don't think, I mean, if you look at them, I hate to keep going to other kinds of primates. It's just the way I'm wired, no pun intended. But I mean, if you look at like glenons of Africa or colobus monkeys, things like that. I mean, they have each different species. They all live on top of each other, but they have very different vocalizations for different kinds of predators and prey and so on. So if you're if you've evolved beyond that point, 30 million years later, and now you're Bigfoot running around, why in the world would you resort to popping a piece of wood against another piece of wood, which has no tonal differentiation, no nuance to it whatsoever, when you have an entire voice box and a tongue and lips to make really nuanced sounds that mean much different things? You see what I mean?
Exactly.
So I agree with Will.
And if you go back to the native folks, that's what they always said. Their primary, way of recognizing these creatures with their ceremonial masks was with the pursed lips, whistling. That was the first thing, but they do a bunch of other things, and they also talk about them mimicking other noises and animals. So, they make a whole range of noises to communicate with one another.
Yeah. Now, why would you resort to banging on things?
Yeah. Now, John and Will and Tom, what do you think about this question, though? Do you think that because they do have a vocal box, that they communicate with each other, whether it's, and I'm not just talking about like a specific language or anything like that, but are there sounds that they make to communicate with each other, to maybe send messages when they're hunting or things like that?
Well, my answer is if we're saying that they're primates, they're not like interdimensional aliens or whatever. We're saying they're primates, and I'm being a little tongue in cheek. Then there's only one answer to that, and that is absolutely, because why? Every other kind of primate, even the smallest monkey in the New World, the marmosets, have sound. They make chirping sounds. But they have different tones and things for different messages. So there's no way that these things would not be vocalizing very specific and individual messages.
Yeah, absolutely. And we get lots of witness reports where they're viewed doing things like that, and it's certainly a communication between each other.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, did you ever get a chance to study Coco? I know that she was the gorilla that in the 1980s.
Yeah, she was the one that was in UC.
Yeah.
It was UC Santa Cruz, and then they moved her. They were going to move her to Hawaii. I'm not sure if they did or not, but yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because she's an example of how apes, in this case a gorilla, but nonetheless, an example of how apes are very, very intelligent, and they do use language, even if they can't always vocalize it. So,
well, yeah. So symbolic, right? Symbolic communication. So yeah, so she was taught like 500 signs of American Sign Language, and she combined signs in new ways that she wasn't taught, and spontaneously created signs. And that's, again, that's a gorilla. That's 8 million years away from us.
Yeah, yeah. And she also had a pet cat, I think.
Yes, she did. Till the
at
poor thing
one
got
point.
hit by a car, yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
The cat did, but the interesting thing about that is Coco was very, very sad, and she was signing, she would take her fingertips and draw them from the bottom of her eyes down her cheeks to say, Coco's sad, because her cat was gone,
Mm-hmm.
I want to go.
Oh, go ahead, Tom. I'm sorry.
I was going to back up a little bit on this, just the tool use, and actually on the some of the wood things, the tree breaks and tree structures. Do any of the primates, like monkeys or gorillas, or chimpanzees or gorillas, do any of those build nests or teepee structures or anything like that we know of, that maybe these things might be doing also?
Yeah, gorillas are famous nest builders. They absolutely build nests. They sleep in the trees. Orangutans sleep in the trees and build nests to a certain extent. But yeah, the great example of that is gorillas. They're nest builders.
So it might make sense that maybe these things do something similar.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of where I land on all of this stuff. I mean, Will knows how I feel about this, but in order to try to understand the possibilities for this thing, it really helps to understand kind of the anthropological world, right? And so if you know kind of what's going on with other primates and humans and so on, then you can get a gauge for what may be happening with these. And so if it's reasonable for a gorilla, why wouldn't it be reasonable for a Sasquatch? It just doesn't make sense that it's not.
Sure. All right, I'm gonna step in with another question, and this is getting more towards a question regarding bones. Oftentimes, the Bigfoot's trackway it's a direct register, 1 foot in front of the other, instead of side by side like with humans. And would there have to be a different pelvis design or structure to the pelvis to enable? Because if you try walking the way their footprints are, you're lopsided. You lose your balance. I'm just curious if you could comment on what you might think their pelvis or spinal column or legs or whatever, what the requirements would be to be able to do that, kind of a foot in front of the foot stride.
It wouldn't be that hard. Really what you're talking about is maybe a differently shaped ischium and certainly an iliac crest, the upper part of the hips would be a little bit different for the hip adductors. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. Where you would see it is in the femur. So the femur would be the curve of the femur would be a little bit more acute than in humans, than generally in humans. But I don't think, other than size, sheer size, I don't think the differences would be stark enough for someone to notice and say, wow, that's not human, unless they were like a paleontologist or a primatologist or something. But yeah, so you'd have to move the hippoductors around a little bit. You have to have wider hippoductors along the ilium, the and the bottom of the pelvis. The shape of the femur, the head of the femur would be at a more acute angle than the shaft. But these things would be relatively subtle because our legs, even though they don't go in a completely straight line, they do go inward, right? They do. Our hip is probably, or our femur, when you put the condyles on the table, I can't remember what degrees it is. It's probably 20 or 30 degrees. It's it bows in.
Yeah, interesting.
Hey, John, this is once again, it's kind of a speculation question, but we've had a lot of reports of these creatures walking on 4 legs at times and 2 legs. And I just wanted to know, what have you heard? Do you think that these creatures mostly walk on 4 legs like a chimpanzee or a gorilla, or are they bipedal for the most part?
Well, if eyewitness counts are something to go by, and they surely are, then you would think that they're very adapted to bipedality. If you're very adapted to bipedality, it becomes difficult to walk on 4 legs. So, for example, if you're a biped, your legs are longer than your arms. If you're a quadruped, like a baboon, your arms and your legs are about the same length. It just makes it more comfortable. Now, there are some exceptions to that. I mean, chimpanzees have pretty long arms. They're mostly knuckle walkers and quadrupeds, but they also can walk bipedally. They just kind of hobble back and forth a little bit. But I would say probably mostly bipedal. But the thing about being a primate is you have a flexible, generalized skeleton, which means you can do a lot with it. Yeah, you can do a lot with your hands and your arms and legs and so on. So it'd be possible, certainly, for them to be quadrupedal. I just personally think it would probably be pretty uncomfortable to do it for long periods of time.
Yeah, I mean, because my theory is that they're pretty much bipedal, but at the same time, I think that they do get on all 4s, mainly to be discreet and stay hidden. Whether we're talking about, being hidden from humans or also hidden from their prey that they're about to attack. So that's kind of always been my theory, but again, that's just kind of speculation. So,
well, I mean, I think it's perfectly fair speculation. And if you ask Will, I mean, being in the military, I mean, he's a biped, but I'm sure when he was out on maneuvers or whatever, he had to get on all 4s to hide or to, to sneak around or whatever, right? So it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I guess it really depends on the circumstances. What you think you need to do in a given situation.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions one of the questions that we run into are the weight of these creatures. And I think they're vastly underestimated. They could be upwards of maybe 1,500 pounds, maybe more, maybe closer to 2,000 pounds. What kind of structural integrity to the muscle mass is it a linear ratio for the strength of the bones to support that muscle mass, or is there some other factor?
No, it would be reflected in the bones for sure. It would also be reflected in in the torso, in the rib cage, right? Again, this goes to environment. So if you're in a colder environment, you're gonna have a deeper thorax. You're gonna be thicker. You're gonna have more mass to surface ratio, so you can maintain heat. So, like for example, Neanderthals were very barrel-chested compared to modern humans. These things would certainly be barrel-chested. Deep thoraxes, very strong, very very thick femora, and legs and so on. So, yeah, you would definitely, if you're talking about that much weight, the bones at the end of the day have to support all that weight, so you would definitely see it.
Hey, John, I have a question to kind of switch topics a little bit, and this is not just talking about Sasquatch, but just in general, what is the average lifespan of most primates?
Well, okay, so it varies if you're talking about captive or not captive. I mean, I think the oldest chimpanzee in the wild, I think, was into her early 40s. In captivity, they live, in their maybe close to into their 50s, but 40s is probably pushing it to the extreme. Probably mostly mid 30s at most for the higher primates.
Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom. No, I was just going to say, that's one of the questions that comes in sometimes is how long are these things out there? Like, how long do they live? And, gorillas and chimpanzees, I know it varies across the different animal, but it would be curious to see if we ever get a report of a Sasquatch and just to see how long they live, because a lot of people don't know about that. They just guess.
Yes, and I'm going to jump in on that. I was wondering if there's a correlation between the size of a primate to its lifespan. I mean, it seems kind of obvious, but I would imagine the bigger the primate, the longer the lifespan, or is there necessarily a correlation there?
No, there's not a correlation to that. There's a correlation to lifespan and reproductive nature, right? So primates tend to have single individuals. They start relatively, single offspring. They start relatively young, and kind of they're spaced out a little bit more than another lower mammals or other kinds of animals. So you have fewer, but you start younger. And so what happens is after 4 or 5, pregnancies, by the time you go through, I mean, put it this way, primates don't go through menopause in the same way that humans do, not because they can't, but because they usually die by the time, females usually die by the time they're just about to go through menopause anyway. Sometimes they'll live a little bit beyond menopause, but not really. It all has to do with reproductive cycle. So a female primate will spend her entire adult life pregnant, nursing, raising young, and when she's too old for that, she will generally no longer be around.
Yeah, Will and Tom, that was a good question, but ironically, it seems that most human beings that are really, really big and tall actually die younger, believe it or not, because it has something to do with their heart and the circulation. It's not able to go to all of its limbs and so forth. So it would make sense that, you would think the larger the being, it would live longer. But
well,
a lot of times
if you're talking human population, though, you'd have to talk the average size of a human, and when you're looking at these really large individuals, that's sort of outside that range of normal, so that puts a lot of stress on their organs and things like that. Whereas the Sasquatch, when we're talking, these things are very large proportionally on a across the board scale, so it's sort of how they're designed. And realistically, John touched on this, for them to live in the environment they live in, they have to be what they are, the size they are, the bulk, all that stuff. So it really, if you were going to make up a creature, this is what you would have to make up to exist in that environment.
Yeah,
exactly.
Male gorillas certainly, and females too, but males are certainly much bigger than humans, weighing 500 pounds or so, and their lifespan is, shorter than ours. Now, granted, our lifespan is what it is because of modernity and technology and health and all that, right? I mean, pre-industrial societies, you didn't live much beyond menopause, but nevertheless, size, they're bigger than us and they don't live any longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting.
Fellas, did you have any more questions? We're kind of running short on time.
I think I'm good. I'm
Brian, anything for you?
Maybe just one last question.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, it's so great to have John on here. I mean, I'm so thankful that he came on the show. But Are you surprised that there haven't been any bodies found of Sasquatch? Or bullets, for that matter. Yeah.
Personally, I mean, I am. I am. I think there's enough people that have run into these things, just kind of, sightings and so forth, and the stories about cars hitting them and so on. I am. Sometimes I'm surprised, and sometimes I'm not. I guess because the where they live is so vast, and parts of it are so unreachable. But it is just super surprising to me that we haven't just found one somewhere.
But you had also mentioned that you thought there could be some misidentification. So there could be Sasquatch bones sitting, like you said, somewhere in a freezer, somewhere just not properly identified. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, so on the one hand, what I'm saying is, I'm kind of surprised that you haven't seen roadkill on the road kind of a thing. But on the other hand, I have no doubt that that there would be a lot of things. I mean, for example, I guess I'm just super cynical when it comes to the scientific community, but I mean, if you find some big, massive femur out there, no one's going to say, I found a Sasquatch leg bone. They're going to say, oh, look, I found somebody with gigantism from a Native American population, right?
And if you go back and look at some of the older books, John Green's works, Ivan Sanderson, some of those, there have been lots of things found. Now we're talking about, again, they didn't just drag the stuff in and say, hey, we got this. You have to look at the individual cases. And of course, one of the more famous ones was, and I want to say 1882, it was early 1880s, the capture of the young one in British Columbia they called Jacko. They had it in a cage for some time. They gave up some pretty good detailed descriptions of the creature and its behaviors. The last they heard of it was the guy who was the quote-unquote owner was going to take it to Europe and show it around, and it died apparently en route, and they threw it overboard. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, we've got a Sasquatch, we got to keep this for science. That wasn't going to happen. In most cases, when these things were found in the past, it was up to the local people, to make a quick decision about what to do with the remains, and usually it was just to either leave them be or ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Will, I think there was also that story that you had mentioned. Somebody had found actually a decomposed body on the lake, on the shore side.
Yeah, a couple of prospectors, a married couple. And they actually did bring the jawbone home. And it sat on the mantelpiece for 14 years until the house burnt down.
Yeah, it was immensely huge.
They said
jawbones.
They said when visitors would come over, they could place the jaw completely over their faces.
Boy, man, that would give you so much information. I mean, just a guy like me, I would just love to have that thing and just look at it.
Wouldn't that have been something?
That would have been amazing.
John, we got to have you on with some guests sometime. I think it'd be really great to have an anthropologist chatting with some of the witnesses we have.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, yeah, that'd be very, very.
I'll pick out a couple of good ones and let you know, and then when we're going to have them, you can decide if you're able to come on.
Okay, that sounds good. I appreciate you guys having me on. I feel like I did all the talking. I apologize.
Well, I told the guys, I said,
oh no,
we wanted to really take advantage of your expertise, and not just kind of bounce around. But I think it was extremely informative. You answered a lot of questions that people frequently contact us and ask about.
Good.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me on. I don't get to, talk about this stuff as much as I used to, so I'm very happy to do it.
We need to get you more in the loop. Because there's always stuff going on.
Yeah, especially with DNA.
Yeah.
And that's in the news a lot, so yeah, for sure.
Yep.
All right, fellas, well, listen. Appreciate everyone. John, thanks again. Fellas, we're going to do the Q&A next, so stay tuned for that segment. Welcome back to the Q&A segment, everyone. We had scheduled to have Chris in Alberta with us today, and KD, our medical doctor friend, but we're going to have to reschedule them because they have scheduling conflicts. But Tom, you've got an update for us. You want to give us that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, excuse me, this goes back to late summer, late August. I was actually, no, excuse me, mid-July was when this started. A buddy of mine and I had gone to an area that I had kind of been suspicious of for quite some time, and actually even spoke with somebody who was in a position to know, and they had said that there's lots of them there, and this person was definitely, somebody who would know. So went down there, and it's a beautiful lake, and honestly, the lake is it's very remote, and it's kind of at the bottom of if you can think of a bowl in the mountains.
For buffalo.
And so anyway, it's at the bottom of this bowl, and you kind of work it. It's about a third of a mile hike to get down there. So on our return trip back, I took a look at a stump that was probably about 8 or 9 feet tall. And the way it had been, the bark had been stripped off of it, and there was a hole in the center. And this is one of those few times when we actually do have pictures. So I'm going to post those on the web, on our creekdevil.com website. I just took a picture of it, thought it was interesting, and didn't think much else. Later on, I think a week or so later, I had gone back and checked it out again, took more pictures, and I sent them to you, Will, and I sent them to another gentleman who, longtime hunter, somebody who's very familiar. And the reason I did that was I wanted to rule out black bear and elk, because they both, the elk will rub their antlers, and but the height of the bark that was stripped off of this thing far exceeds what I would expect from an elk or a black bear. And the amount of bark that was stripped off is just peeled off in strips. And I don't know if you remember your response to me, but it was, well, you need to look around. Do the obvious, look at the ground. And I was like, that makes sense. So I went back there, and my buddy and I went back a couple weeks later looking at the ground, and that's when I saw the footprints. I was like, oh my gosh. I've seen a lot of evidence. I've heard a lot of things, but this was the first time I've looked at the ground and saw footprints. And they were, they're an impression in the forest duff. And if you know a little bit about how that duff is, it's very spongy. So to get about an inch and a half impression, I can only imagine how much weight would have to be thrust down to get that, and to compress it so that it stays. Because I'm guessing these footprints were 2 or 3, maybe even 4 weeks old. They had a lot of debris inside of them.
1 year, $2 million.
So measured them, probably 14, 15 inches long. And my buddy, who's been elk hunting in areas not too far from there, looked around, and then I found the left foot, and within a minute or two later, he found the right foot, and then we started finding footprints everywhere. And what really keyed me, or one of the things that I found interesting, Will, is we've talked about this, where they don't walk in a straight line. They meander around, which is precisely what these footprints did. So, and this was, when I found the footprints, this was exactly 8 days after those kind of scream barks that I'd mentioned, I think a couple of episodes back. Where this is, there's an unrestricted corridor, if you could think of it as that, kind of a valley corridor, a canyon that goes for miles and miles. But it does connect to the area where we heard those screams. Where my wife and I heard the screams camping. So just kind of a heads up to everybody out there. It seems obvious, but when I was in the woods, your mind is kind of distracted with a lot of different things, just walking around, and the ground is covered with a lot of brush and that sort of thing, small scrub brush and little berries and whatnot. So it was, anyway, it was a good thing that you had mentioned to go back and look at the ground and produce good results. So anyway, that's the update on that. And I will, like I said, I've got a lot of pictures of what we found, including the stump itself. And I don't know if you remember, Will, but you had sent me a picture of one that you found up in the Bluff Creek area, a similar stump.
Yeah, it was all, those were scraped by nails. They weren't teeth.
Yes.
They weren't other things, that were nails.
Yeah, that's exactly what this was.
And one of those photographs is actually in my first book, Notes from the Field.
Okay.
Tom, that's interesting. But you're saying that the footprints were not in a straight line?
No, they weren't. They would meander over here. They would go over there. And they actually seemed kind of haphazard, just all over the place. But Will, you've mentioned that before, that a lot of times they will just kind of wander around.
I think the difference is, if they're moving from point A to point B, then they're going to be in a straight line. If they're in an area where, they're foraging or whatever it is they're doing, then they're going to see this meandering pattern back and forth and looping around and just a very disorganized appearing way.
Yeah.
So Tom, that brings up a good question, though. I mean, do you think that they were hunting before you found the tracks?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think this stump had something of interest to him. You'll see the picture. It's kind of rotten, and it is full of termite holes. So there's a lot of insects or some sort of wood-burrowing worms or insects that maybe they're just tearing this thing apart for food, for a little protein source. Will, what are your thoughts? Why do they? What's their interest in these rotten stumps?
I think you're probably right in that case. I mean, bear do the same thing, but you can tell a bear because you'll see claw marks when they're tearing the stump apart.
Yeah. So, and I would imagine while they're doing that, they're also going to be, they're opportunists, so they're going to be looking for, if a deer or elk or something stumbles into the area, woe to that animal. And speaking of animals in the area, as we're leaving the area, there's a pretty good size pile of scat from a mountain lion. So it's a nice predator area.
Yeah. Will, we were talking about this a little bit before the show, but Tom brought up a great point about orchards. And do you think that attracts them? Because it might attract deer? So do you think that attracts Sasquatch because that's who they hunt?
Well, I've seen a few places. I'll give you an example. North of the town of Carson in southern Washington, I don't know if the trees are still there or not, but when I was working that area in the 80s and 90s, there was some old abandoned orchards, and I would periodically check those. And late in the season, September or so, when the fruit was on, you would see those trees stripped of all the fruit up to 10 feet up. Nothing on the ground. Of course, other animals, deer and etc., eat the stuff on the ground, but it was clear that the fruit had been picked up to, I guess, whatever height they could reach. And usually, a dozen or so of those trees in the area would be stripped of that fruit. And there was a lot of Sasquatch activity in that area at that time, lots of reports. So, and I believe we even had a couple where people actually saw them in there collecting the fruit off them trees, so it was pretty easy to connect the dots in those cases. But yeah, occasionally, that's a draw for lots of animals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we were talking about that. Um, and I think it would also draw in, the deer and the elk because they like to forage on the stuff that's easily reached, generally the windfall. So maybe it's a kind of a double thing for the Sasquatch. They can both get the fruit off the trees, but they can also, they may have an opportunity to get a deer or an elk or something that's foraging on the apples.
And who knows, that may be the main draw of them coming in there in the first place is actually the animals, and then taking the fruit as a byproduct, of that venture into that location.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was about to say that these things probably weigh, some people think as much as 1,000 pounds or maybe more. And fruit, an apple, for instance, is not going to provide a lot of calorie intake, but an animal that's attracted to that area would be.
Yeah, especially in the fall. I mean, they're bulking up for winter, so you're going to see mostly protein, but they're going to supplement that diet with everything that's available.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I thought of the area where the stump was. I think they may have been after more than just the termites and the bugs and the stump, because that whole lake is surrounded by these natural wild berries that grow in the Cascades, and the time of year they're ripe. So the bears come in, and who knows what else.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff this time of year, and like I said, if you go into those places and just kind of slow down, look around very carefully, and you'll see evidence of different animals and these things being present.
Speaking of bears, do you think that these creatures will attack bears, or are they more prone, obviously, to go after deer? But I mean, will they hunt bears for food?
These things will eat anything they can get.
Interesting.
So I wonder what the you think about like mountain lions and, like Brian said, bears, and they'll eat anything they can get their hands on. Well, surely all the wildlife in the area must be aware of these things, and they must be put on notice, and they detect them by smell or sound or whatever. I would imagine they would kind of clear out of the area if they had a chance.
Yeah, I've seen places where, especially where there was a lot of Sasquatch scat, the areas are pretty devoid of other animals.
Yeah, and that was the thing. Excuse me, that was interesting, because I've been in this little lake many times. Usually there's a lot of elk and deer sign there, and there is absolutely none at this time. I mean, that was the thing we found strange. Was the only thing that we found was a pile of mountain lion scat, and that was it. So I think somebody got the message, and also I should mention, as we were leaving, because this is a very high elevation area, as we dropped down into lower elevations, probably 3,000 feet or more lower, and miles and miles from this area, start to get into some of the rural homes and little farms and stuff in the area, and saw tons of deer in people's yards, whole herds of deer in people's yards. Just kind of interesting.
Yeah,
Tom,
sometimes about them being that close to people.
Tom, that's such a great point, because Will, I know that you interviewed somebody on a different program, but this is a few years ago, but I know that there was one witness that came on that said that his entire house, his entire neighborhood was just, there were deer everywhere, he said. And it makes me wonder if they were kind of, getting together as a way to, as a means of defense for these animals. I mean, why would all these deer be in the same place? What do you think about that?
Well, I used to wonder about it myself driving up to Mount Rainier. We used to hike and camp up there quite a bit. And when you go up to the Nisqually entrance, there's a town called Ashford up there, and we used to joke right around hunting season, you'd see all the deer and elk hanging around the pastures near homes on the edge of the town. And but it's also, that area is a very active area for these creatures, and they're typically seen in there during that time period. So it kind of makes you wonder, the kind of the double protection away from hunters and possibly these creatures by hanging around close to human habitation.
Yeah. And Brian, I think you might have been talking about, you may have been talking about Lee or somebody else, but I know that Lee's mentioned that when these creatures would, when they were in the area, there was just an extraordinary large amount of deer in people's yards, like maybe 40 deer or more.
And we actually hear that from quite a few people.
Yeah. Well, when I first contacted you, Will, and Brian, about that whistle encounter I had up in the same area, about a mile from this one spot, the thing that we found strange was driving up there, my buddy and I noticed there was 40 or 50 elk in somebody's pasture right next to the house. And this is really odd for elk to just be hanging out in somebody's, cow pasture.
Yeah, I mean,
it's happened.
When I was growing up, we would occasionally have elk early morning grazing with our cattle in the pastures, but I mean, that's kind of normal. But in some of these situations, I think there's something going on other than just, feeding because they can feed anywhere. But it's odd at that very particular time of year, and not just that time of year, but that we have other situations too where we'll get a location where there's Sasquatch sightings going on frequently, and then all of a sudden you'll mention something to the witness. Have you seen deer around? They say, yeah, they've been all of a sudden hanging out around the house and in very close proximity to humans. Yeah,
and that is kind of strange because you go up to the area where these creatures are, and the whole forest is just covered with this lush green, leafy, deciduous, broadleaf plants, all the things that these, the elk love and deer, but they're not up there.
Right.
They're down in these, brown, dry pastures.
Yeah, sometimes it's very odd, but there is you can see the correlation when you go from, one incident to the other to the next and so on. You'll see a very similar pattern.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be an interesting thing to, track the statistics on that and see if there's a kind of a trend that develops. I'm sure there is.
Yeah, it's funny because you would think that if an animal like that feels threatened, just run away, just go on a marathon and just get the hell out of the area. But the fact that all of them seem to get together in the same place is almost, I guess, nature's reaction to a defense mechanism. Maybe they can defend themselves by being in a group, essentially.
Well,
I mean, it doesn't work.
And it's interesting,
well,
too.
There's safety in numbers.
Well, not just safety in numbers, but the fact that they go to very close to where humans are. It's sort of like running from one predator towards another one, for protection.
Yeah, and the pastures that we would see them in are very, very vast and wide open areas.
Yeah, they can see.
They can see. Yeah, they got visibility. They can, they got a little bit of a heads up if these things show up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how are we looking for questions this week from our listeners?
We got a few of them here. We got some good ones. I got a guy named Frank. I'll just start off. He's got an interesting question. He says, have we heard anything about a Sasquatch-related military operation in progress at the oil pipeline between Canada and the U.S.?
I haven't heard anything about that. And I'll tell you something, too. If it was a real military operation, you wouldn't hear about it.
Right. Yeah, they generally keep that stuff confidential.
Yeah, I mean, even training missions are typically, because it is part of training, to have any sort of a blackout on information.
Yeah. All right, so I'll just jump on. We got another question here, and this is I like this one. This is from a gentleman named a little kid named Piper, 5th grader in Fred Sieber's class in Okinawa.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, and he wants to know, has Sasquatch ever interacted with a human in a friendly way? And if so, how? So Piper, good question.
Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to Fred and your class. Great group of people. To my knowledge, there hasn't been, quote unquote, a friendly exchange. I mean, there are some reports that make that claim, but I think oftentimes it's more the viewer or witnesses' interpretation of what happened instead of what was really going on. Where instead of it being a friendly encounter, it may have been a very benign type encounter. But the witness puts their own anthropomorphic views on a situation instead of what was really happening.
That brings up an interesting point that I've often wondered about, and that is the coexistence of humans in close relationship to these creatures. If there's ever going to be a time when there could be a non-conflict, coexistence between the two, we've had millennia for that to be established. I mean, thousands of years, not hundreds of years, thousands of years.
I think if they're close to people, they're either going to be very wary and maybe not be as aggressive as they are farther out into wild areas. When you look at reports and older stories, the more remote an area is away from human habitation, it seems like the more violent the behavior is. So it could be a fact that they're more wary, closer to people, just because they know we're going to come after them in numbers. So
their true nature kind of comes out when they feel comfortable.
Right. So it's not necessarily friendly or benign, so to speak, but it's much more cautious behavior because of possible repercussions.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And animal behavior, it doesn't change. I mean, I take that back. Behavior can change, but their instinct behind the behavior doesn't change. The basic instinct, the basic nature of the animal remains the same.
Yeah, it's always there. It's just, it's going to adjust according to situations.
Yeah, exactly. So, if they haven't learned how to get along with this in the last 12,000 years, it's not going to start now.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And Will, do you think that because of the growing population, that they now have less fear of humans? I mean, obviously they're not going to embrace us, and we're not going to get along. But do you think that their actual threat to humans is greater because maybe they have less fear of humans, especially in the last few years?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a number of reasons. It's because our behavior has changed. We've talked about this before where, I know when Tom and I were young, and we want no Stone Age jokes there.
No, it was Lincoln.
It was common to go out and just shoot at anything, nobody cared. And of course that doesn't happen today. The behavior of people is very different, and we're not seeing it just with these things, but coyotes are very brazen now. And of course, cougar and bear and things like that, they have much less fear of people. And it's because of our behavior. So, yeah, I definitely think their behavior is becoming more aggressive.
That's interesting because, coyotes are becoming a lot more brazen. And they don't read the papers and go, people are not, we don't have as much fear from them. But they're keen observers. All animals are, of human behavior. And we're seeing their natural instinct, the nature of the animals, regardless of what the animal is, come out. They're becoming more brazen.
Yeah, I know. I saw one 2 mornings ago at work. And, where I work, some of the area is kind of remote. And before, you wouldn't see much of anything like that, but they're definitely coming in closer to where people are.
Yeah. Well, and there's some YouTube videos where they're actually in parks, city parks, and people are having confrontations with them.
I believe there were even some issues in Southern California in the past, number of years where weren't they coming in after children and things like that? They were, very brazen acts that these animals were doing.
Well, that and then also, the mountain lions in Southern California I think it's still an ongoing problem. But there was one where a mountain lion attacked, I think it was a 9-year-old girl when the parents were on a hiking trail, just not in the wilderness, but just kind of a wooded hiking trail. Now, mom went into overdrive and just beat the heck out of the mountain lion.
Right. Yeah. What else are you going to do in that situation?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the cat's in for it. And she did the right thing and saved her daughter's life.
But I've read stories where even grown men hiking alone, have had cougars attack them. So all these animals' behaviors are very different, and I think a lot of it's because our behaviors become different.
Yeah. Well, there's that, there's a young guy, it's a young guy. There's a hiker in Colorado less than a year ago who was attacked by a mountain lion. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but he killed it with his bare hands. He was, and it was a younger one. He said it really wasn't, he didn't think it had the skill and the experience and the size, but it was kind of a me or him thing. And he said he didn't have any choice. I think he just strangulated it.
But here's the thing, and people, I think a lot of us have forgotten this because we think we have a certain perception of ourselves, and really we're more than that perception. What the perception is what we have become through society and our own rules and things like that. But if you step back, if you're in a bad situation like that, you have to remember that we still are part of nature, and we're actually a big animal. So if something the size of a cat were to attack us, we should be able to fairly well defend ourselves, and if not, kill that animal. And And I think prior to all of this social stuff, I think a lot of animals feared us because we had that ability.
Will, that's a great point. And you mentioned that our nature has changed. And I'm just wondering what you think the difference is between our behavior, our nature, in 2019 has changed from the 1980s and 1990s and so forth, and how, because you said that they feel more of a threat by us because of what we have done. So I'm just wondering what you think specifically what we have done that has changed them.
Well, look over the history of humans, kind of a general broad stroke. We basically went out from just feeding ourselves, and they use the term hunter-gatherers, by pretty much, killing everything we come into contact with. A lot of primitive cultures, not just primitive, but our own as well, it was sort of a mark of rite of passage, by being able to go out and kill the biggest, baddest thing out there. And a lot of cultures still do that, sort of proving manhood and things like that. And I'm sure that has roots in, long ago history where, we may have been preyed upon and decided, well, that wasn't going to happen anymore. So you go out and start killing, and being that provider and all that sort of thing. Right up until the recent past few decades where, that's become more or less unpopular, at least in certain segments of society. But it's enough to have changed some of this behavior. And at some point, I think that's a real disservice to us as a species because we are what we are. I think a lot of that kind of translates into us doing more violent acts to each other instead of maybe having that as an outlet. I don't know, but there's definitely been that change, and the reaction by the animal kingdom is to sort of push back where we had made that boundary out, beyond us up until recent times. Now that boundary is coming back in toward us.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Oh, yeah,
go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was just going to say, because if we look back at history, human history, we used to hunt animals for food. In other words, to basically stay living.
Right.
But now there's with hunting and so forth, we don't attack animals for food necessarily. I mean, some people still do, but the fact that now we're hunting them for game almost makes me think that there's kind of more of a reaction from animals. You said coyotes, and but even like Bigfoot, the fact that we're not hunting them necessarily for food anymore. We're just hunting them for the sake of hunting them, or that we're out there camping, and we are probably invading their territory.
Yeah, our just demeanor is not very aggressive anymore. We're sort of, I guess for a lack of better term, kind of wimpy compared to what our species has been from beginning to the past few decades. I understand where people's thinking is with all this. However, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You have to have some of this behavior and be responsible with it. I understand. There's so much we could go into. We don't need to, but that's sort of the cause and effect, I believe, of what's going on.
Yeah.
One of the interesting questions that I think about with all this is, the coyotes, they don't have a memory. The coyote's lifespan is considerably shorter than humans. So the ones that are alive today, and probably the deer and most of the other animals, don't really have a memory of when we were the way we were 50 years ago.
No, they're
25,
reacting.
30
They're
years.
reacting to our behavior currently.
Yes.
Now, the ones, say, back in the 60s or 70s, those animals, they had a good reason to be very shy of humans because we were very open about going out and killing them.
Well, and Will, you probably remember this, that I remember growing up as a kid that we were always taught that you're never going to see a bear. You will never see a bear in the woods because they're gone.
Usually they were, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw
and they're
one.
still skittish.
I saw one when I was a kid because my dad let a friend of his have 300 beehives on our property, and the bear come up after the honey in the beehives. Other than that,
I was going to say, I wonder why the bear was there.
wasn't looking for these three little kids. I was within probably 5 or 6 feet of the bear when it was coming up the slope, and that was an underwear changing moment too. Let me tell you, I think I was probably 8 or 9 at the time, and I had 2 little sisters in tow, so I just yelled bear and run, and we took off. Of course, the bear wasn't interested in us; it wanted the honey. Tore the hives up pretty good. But if the beehives hadn't been out there, we would have never seen a bear ever.
Yeah.
And we didn't see coyotes. There were lots of them around, but you never saw them.
Right.
You could hear them at night all over the place. Same with cougar. I don't think I didn't see cougar tracks until geez, I was a teenager hunting deer and elk. And it was rare even then because they just didn't hang around where people were.
No, they didn't. The state I live in, Oregon, I don't know if California and Washington has done similar legislation, but they eliminated, 40 years ago, the ability to hunt cougar with dogs. And then there's
same with bear.
Yes, yeah.
The one time I hunted bear was we used dogs, and it was pretty exciting. Actually, we never got near the bear, but that's the way it used to be. Of course, that was late '60s.
Yeah. And so, and I had a guy that I knew had a ranch in another town, and he was really upset about this. He said, "Look, they're on my property all the time, and." In the morning you'll see maybe the horses will have claw marks on their back from the mountain lions. Of course, and the donkeys. Of course, a donkey when it gets attacked by a mountain lion. This is a good thing about donkey. It'll send the mountain lion into the next county with a good swift kick.
Oh yeah, horses will too.
Yeah. But they still get the claw marks on their back.
And even cows. We grew up having cattle all the time, and I don't remember anything ever really bothering them in terms of attacking them. They were pretty good about defending themselves, and they would stay in a group all the time.
Yeah. Well, if you have a herd of cows, you what are you talking? 1,100-pound beast?
Oh,
a whole bunch of them.
We had ours were closer to probably 2,000 pounds. The old man liked to raise them big. So, a funny story. I had one. I used to be given a calf every year. That was how I earned my school clothes for the following year, because my dad would say, "Well, I did all the outside work with the animals," and he'd say, "Okay, you want me to give you, this is your calf. We'll raise it, and then when I sell it on the market, then you'll get the money. That's your school clothes for next year." And the last one I had, that thing was close to 2,000 pounds. I think he thought he was still a calf, and I would play with him like a dog. That was the method for the really great meat. There was never any tension in the animal. So he'd see me, I'd come home from school, and I'd make the mistake of climbing over the fence to go to the cherry trees around the pasture, and he thought it was time to play. And here's this locomotive coming at me, and I'd practically kill myself getting over the fence to get away from him.
I have been in that situation a couple times. Yeah, you're right. That's the best way to put it. Here's this locomotive coming after you.
when they want to play, all you can do is run.
Yeah. and they think that's just part of the game.
Oh yeah, they think it's part of the game.
Yeah, and you're like in everything you got to get out of there.
They think they're still 50 pounds, and they're close to 2,000. I think that particular one dressed out at 1,900 pounds when he was butchered, but I'm like, holy crap.
Yeah, we had one when we used to have to walk home from school. And here we go. Back when Lincoln was in office, we had to walk home from school. And it was probably a mile, but there was this pasture that we had to walk by, and there was one extremely belligerent bull that was in the pasture. I have no idea why, but it would see these kids walking along the roads, a little country road, and it'd just come charging at you, and you'd take off running. Even though there's a fence between you and him, it would butt its head against the fence post, and they would bend over. Like, man, I hope that thing holds.
Oh, yeah. No, I tell you, when we were, was it again back in the 60s, we lived back on 40 acres that we had. We were the last property on the end of this old, it was still a dirt road that goes back there. Talk about country. That was out in the sticks. But my old man had he had an Angus bull. That was his idea for breeding, instead of paying, for somebody to bring a bull in. But this thing, he nicknamed it the Ghost, because it could go through any fence. Didn't matter how good the fence was you built, it would go through it. So I remember him and his buddies one Saturday morning, they went out and tied him down and put a brass ring in his nose, thinking that was going to calm him down. It didn't, so they put a 10-foot logging chain on that with the rear wheel of a bicycle with the sprocket and everything. They thought that would slow him down. Oh no, it didn't. and that thing was so mean. That bull was so mean. It would chase anyone.
Yeah.
And I remember I come home from school one day, and my mom, she said that it had gotten out and chased her and a family friend around the house. So she called my dad at work, and he came home and got his .6 and went out and shot it and killed it. And I guess they'd had enough of the bull getting out and causing mischief. But, it sounds cruel, the stuff they did, with the brass ring and the chain and everything, but it didn't bother the animal at all that stuff. And it just sure didn't slow him down.
Oh, it was, it was funny because we'd walk along and that bull would be, it would be way out in the middle of the pasture. And it'd be, and as soon as it would out of the corner of our eye, it would catch a glimpse of you and start walking. And then the walk would turn into a trot. And then it was full on.
Oh, yeah.
And you're full on running to get away because the fence is, like a block long. So you're, little kid, you're running and you're looking for trees in case he gets out.
I was just thinking back. You guys remember I mentioned when we lived back there, and this probably would have been around 1968. And it was after the bear, probably a year after the bear incident. So we didn't know if the bear was close around or not, but our cattle had a pattern that they would follow around our property. And you kind of knew where they would be on the 40 acres throughout the daylight hours. And this one day, they were in the barn with their heads sticking out and their ears all out. And normally they would have been, quite a ways away from the house at that time of day. But they were all up there, and they were acting kind of scared, and there was something in the nearby tree line just thrashing the trees. You couldn't see what it was, but it was something that was big in there.
Oh, you could see the trees moving?
Oh, yeah, big time. It was really thrashing the edge of the brush. Making a big display. And my mom, of course, she said, I was riding my bike around. She said, hey, come over and take a look at this. Her and my sisters were standing there. And I just remembered that bull was also in the barn at that time. And I thought that animal was never afraid of anything, except that one particular day it was in there with the rest of the cows. And I just, thinking back, thought, geez, that was kind of odd because he was never, ever afraid of anything.
And what was it? Will we know what meets the criteria? What grabs big trees or brush and thrashes them back and forth?
And this is in the same area as the rock quarry monster. When that incident happened, it was right around that same year that happened, which was in close proximity to the Puyallup Screamer incidents. That was only a couple of miles away from where we lived.
Yeah. And what's going to intimidate a 2,000-pound obnoxious, belligerent bull?
Well, something big and mean, that's for sure. I went
bigger and meaner.
Yeah, I went out and looked for tracks the next day. I wasn't going to go out there with something out there in the brush that day as a kid. I was all over that acreage, but there was lots of river sand back there, and I didn't see any. I was looking for bear tracks, didn't see any kind of bear tracks at all. My dad and his buddies, when we hunted the bear after we had that encounter with it, we think they chased it off all the activity with the dogs and everything. It just headed for the hills. We never saw any kind of sign again, but whatever was back there, I don't think was a bear, not thrashing the brush like that. I saw it. It was quite a display.
Yeah. Well, that's you talk about consistent behavior and activity of these creatures. What was it, the two bikers who were down in Port Orford area?
Oh, yeah, two Hells Angels, yeah.
Yeah,
very
and
similar.
That thing was, thrashing the brush.
The way he described it was identical to what I saw. The only difference was they actually saw the creature, and the brush was so thick there you couldn't see what was doing it. But it wasn't
Yeah.
just brush being moved around. It was like something had hands on. I mean, and just wrenching the stuff over on the ground. I mean, it was really violent.
So I'm wondering what the purpose, because obviously they're not concealing themselves at that point. They're trying to do an intimidation thing, or
Something. I mean, now nobody was out there. It was the animals.
yeah,
Now, where it first happened or any of that, we don't know. There was, I mean, no clue.
right.
The only thing we thought at that time it was a bear, but there was no sign of a bear around there.
And bears don't do that.
No,
You know,
not with what I saw. Yeah, that certainly was not a bear.
Yeah, and you know, there's other reports, even historic ones, where they you just hear it a lot, and even Lee was talking about when he was there and that he had that encounter. He said it was just a few feet from when he turned around to look, and he said it was grabbing this branch and going.
Well, and I think one of the best examples was when we were doing Witness of the Unknown. We had Troy on. So if anybody goes back and listens to that episode, him and his two buddies watched this thing when it came down the slope and just threw this horrible tantrum. And it did exactly that big display in front of those three guys.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Station, yeah.
Yeah, that was, you know, the fact that you even lived through something like that and not have a full-on cardiac arrest. You know?
They would have had to hose me down on the spot. I would have crapped all over myself.
Well, and he said it was so close he could see, you know, it had a missing tooth.
Weren't they only like 20 feet or less away from it? It was really close.
Yeah, it was just across a little creek. That would have been nothing for this thing to cross that
tiny creek, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Will,
yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah.
Or Brian, I'm sorry.
So on that note, why do you think that it didn't attack Troy in that case?
Well, I think in that case I think number one, it was probably a younger one, probably a young adult or maybe an older juvenile.
So not mature.
Not mature, okay. Right. Probably a sentry. It was probably the fact that it was one of it and three of them. You know, because typically it's a numbers game with these things. Now, had they tried to move in a little closer, that might have been more violent, but I think at that time it was just a territorial display.
Mm-hmm. Just a tantrum.
Yeah, it was saying, you can't go any further than this. This is it, right here.
And I think they all responded, and didn't one of them he had something caught. I think he had a fishing lure or something caught in his arm, and it didn't matter. Just, we're getting out of here.
Right, yeah, get the hell out. I think they even left poles.
Yeah. The poles aren't that important anymore.
Yeah, your values kind of change in those situations.
in a nanosecond.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you know, I just want to say this. Hey, Troy, if you're listening, try to get a hold of Will. We'd like to hear from you again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking
fascinating account.
Giving a shout out, I wanted to give a shout out to our friends up at the Flathead Reservation, to Wynn especially, and our good friends at the Klamath Reservation. You know, we definitely love to hear from you folks.
Yeah, wasn't there some recent activity at one of those?
Yes. Yeah, up the Flathead Reservation, but of course they got hit by a big snowstorm, so I'm sure that'll sideline anything that's going on there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I've got another question here. This is Bernard. He's from Northeast Ohio. He said he was wondering, I like this question. This is great. And we've actually talked about this, Will. The strength of the creatures. Does it? And he wants to know if it depends on whether it's a type 1, 2, 3, or 4. And he wants to know if we've heard of any activity around the Metro Park area in Ohio, or Salt Fork State Park, anywhere in Ohio. Have we heard of anything?
I'm trying to remember where Rodney is, because I just got a message from him this morning. He's got some more activity happening there. I want to say he's in that area, but I wouldn't, don't hold me to that. But yeah, there's been some activity there, especially recently, if that's where he's at. And I don't think it matters so much the types, but in terms of strength and things like that.
And that was something that we were going to kind of pursue a little bit was what is the breaking strength of a green, say 3.5 inch in diameter tree, whether it's an oak tree or a Douglas fir. I mean, that the amount of the integrity, the structural integrity of green wood is phenomenal.
Yeah, I'd like to know what the PSI would be for that, for twisting and snapping something like that. I'm sure it's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If anybody out there, maybe works at a university or something, or a some sort of a civil engineering test lab or anything where you have those devices that measure that stuff, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, Will, I was going to ask to kind of switch topics a little bit. We've talked before, and we have plenty of examples where witnesses, if they're out alone and they're talking on the phone, that is kind of a good way to deflect attention from these creatures. But I was just curious what you think about flashlights. How do these creatures respond to flashlights?
It's a good defensive mechanism, especially if it has a like a strobe feature. That seems to sort of put you and these things a little space between you. They don't like that.
Okay, have you had a lot of witness interviews where people have used flashlights or something like that? Not necessarily a flashlight, but maybe like a laser beamer or something like that.
I've been a few. In fact, I used to carry, I don't have one anymore, but I used to have a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight, and have been in a couple situations where that definitely helped when we were working the occult situation towards the very end when the creatures, prior to their departing the area, I took a small team of 5 people into an area north of the Goldhammer home, and it was kind of a mistake because the creatures were in there, and we sort of got, there was one trail into this thicket of trees, and there really wasn't any other way out of there. Especially once we got in there, we were kind of surrounded by these things, and we knew they were there because we could see the eye shine, watch their eyes blinking, things like that, and that bright spotlight really made the difference in keeping them at bay. So the behavior was very aggressive. They were making a lot of noise, snapping trees. In the back of the line, I was leading the team in, and they said they heard growling. So, and they weren't backing away. They kind of kept their position, but we went in there, and as soon as the stuff started happening, we simply backtracked out of there quickly. But the light made a big difference.
Right.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. That was, I thought, you probably get in there and you're like, I wish I was home right now.
It was kind of rainy, so it was quiet. Now, when it's raining like that, it's a great cover. It's good. We used to call, in the military when I was in the Army, we'd call that noise and light camouflage. So, light camouflage, of course, it was use darkness, cover darkness to mask your movements. But if weather's inclement, especially raining, it really reduces the amount of noise you make. So, So that happens with these things. When it's raining, they can move much more easily, and you're not going to hear a lot of that noise from the movements.
Well, I would think it'd be maybe similar if it's snowing. If you're getting a hard snow,
it's very quiet then. Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't really, it just fresh, fluffy snow is a great sound absorber.
It is, especially, if anybody's experienced being out in the snow, it becomes very quiet, and it's because all that noise is muffled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So don't go hunting these things when it's snowing. Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, Will, so how much do you think that the weather affects their movement patterns on that note?
I don't think it affects, in terms of affecting them, I don't think it affects them a whole bunch. I think they utilize it. Like I said, when it's raining or snowing, it's much easier for them to move, more stealthily, because those situations on the wetness of the ground, definitely muffles any noise that would be made in the duff and things like that during drier weather. But yeah, I think it makes it much more easy for them to move, and especially hunting and things like that.
Okay. That's a good point, Brian, and it kind of brings up a question of their screaming. If they're trying to be stealthy, those loud screams are the last thing in the world, so they must serve some kind of a function. I know we've talked about this in the past, but I'm just wondering if they might use coordinated screams or vocalizations to drive the prey into a kill zone or something.
They may, or when it's in a close situation, like a close ambush hunt, they're probably not using vocalizations during those situations. The loud vocals are probably more of a territorial thing, or warnings or other uses like that. If there's humans in the area or something like that. If they're in a hunting mode, that's where we're going to hear things like the tongue pops and that kind of stuff.
Okay, and maybe the same thing for the whistles might be a hunting mode, or?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a whistle's going to be less, identifiable by the prey animals than, say, a vocalization would be. Vocalization's a dead giveaway of what's there, where the whistle probably isn't.
Yeah, when you hear the scream for the first time, everybody goes, what in the heck was that?
Yeah.
It doesn't match with any known animal that you've ever heard before.
And you kind of have to be careful even with whistling, because you have to know if there are marmots in the area, because marmots will whistle just like a human.
Yeah, marmots do.
I've watched them do it.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, they do. It's a shrill. I'm just going back to that one that I heard back 2 years ago, and it had such a deep, it sounded like it had a locomotive engine behind it.
Yeah, these things, when they make their noises, it's going to be on a different scale than other animals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the little marmots are cute little animals. These other things aren't.
Well, true.
And Will, you said, I think last time, that when these things have these large screams, they're not necessarily directing that towards humans. It's more of an internal thing, maybe for the rest of their family or whoever's hunting.
Yeah, they're not communicating with humans in any way, shape, or form. It's between them.
Right. And also, on that note, too, the fact that there are such loud screams perhaps is a message not towards the immediate area, but also the rest of the forest that might be miles away.
Yeah, it could be for adjacent areas. And when we talked to John in the first segment, we had kind of an illuminating moment there when I was thinking we were talking about these noises that they make in conjunction with tool use. We get these people all these people who insist on tree knocks. We hear noises, and tongue pops are some of that, because we're getting noises from places where there there isn't wood, like we got from Richard in Florida. I suspect a lot of those noises, if they are occurring, are not tree knocks, or certainly not communication with people or themselves. It could be a result of some form of tool use. In other words, you're crushing something or doing something with a stone that sounds like knocking on trees when it's actually some form of tool use that's going on. I suspect that's much more likely the answer than what a lot of people have jumped to conclusions of.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah, you think about it, it doesn't make sense. The more you think about it, why I don't think any other primate picks up a stick and hits it against a tree
No,
for communication.
and John was very clear about that. As an anthropologist who knows these things, he was very clear about that when we discussed that earlier. And I agree. It's not something other primates do. However, they will use tools. All of them use tools of some form, and these things probably do also. So for whatever it is they're using, I'm sure if they're making that noise, that's what the source is, or the reasoning is behind it. They're using a tool for whatever reason. We don't know.
Hey, Will, I do have one. I know that we're almost out of time here, but I do have one last question. In terms of tool use, do you think that these creatures, for the most part, they kill deer? But do you think, for the most part, they do it with their hands, or do they use tools to do that?
Well, we don't know for sure, but I suspect it's by hand because, number one, they have the strength and ability to do that. And then we do have some eyewitnesses. We interviewed a guy, I remember, a while back who actually watched one of these things. They were hunting a group of deer, and one killed deer or it didn't kill him, it hobbled it right in front of him. It broke the legs, remember? And then left it, and then it went to pursue the other deer, and then came back for that one and killed it with its hands.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that's how they, for the most part, kill them. They just kill them by hand.
Okay.
And with their strength, it would be very quick. I mean,
right? They just break the necks.
If they can twist and snap, 3-inch fir trees with their bare hands, then a deer's neck isn't going to be much different.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Well, fellas, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Oh no, just enjoy having these kind of casual, kind of unstructured, informal chats once in a while. They're really nice.
Yeah, and remember, anybody that has an encounter that they want to come on the show, let us know.
Yes, by all means.
And if you do, I just want to throw in, we have two ways to reach us. Obviously, questions, plural, questions at creekdevil.com. We want to hear from you. We want to hear about your encounters, any questions that you have, because all the questions are great questions. And if you want to reach us with an encounter, just encounters, again, encounters plural, at creekdevil.com. You can do either one. That's fine. But we've set up two different email accounts for that very purpose. So look forward to hearing from you.
As an update, too, I did just hear from KD, our medical doctor friend. He was called to duty, so that's why he wasn't able to come on today. But we will have him on in the near future, so we can, we're looking forward to some questions from people in conjunction with this subject from a medical doctor. And it may not make the correlation, but things like DNA and other physical things like we did with John, our anthropologist. So, if you have questions for professionals, we have a number of professionals we're going to bring on the show and discuss various areas, maybe not directly related to the Sasquatch, but I'll give you an example. I have a friend who's a judge in Montana, and I'm going to try to convince him to come on, and we're going to talk legal issues, things that can be connected with the subject. For instance, we discussed with John a little bit what would happen if you were to bring a body of one of these things in. What would the legal ramifications be? An anthropologist, of course, gave us his perspective from his expertise, but we'd like to hear it from our legal professional friend also. Things like that. So if you have questions regarding professionals, by all means send them in, and we'll bring them up with these different professionals as we bring them on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Well, fellas, great chat as always. We'll pick it up again next time.
Okay, sounds
good. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.